Welcome back. In this chapter, I do two more of these studies. The first one is based on the nose of Scarlett Johansson, and I have collected a few descriptive reference images again. I start with the same base mesh that I was using in the previous chapter, so it's the one that is also available in the assignment folder of the first lesson. And I have just tried to get the width of the nose right from the front view. And then I try to quickly switch into the profile view to get an idea of how far her nose sticks out of the front plane of her head and face. And as soon as I have described and established some of the primary forms, I simply browse through the different reference images that I have prepared to get a good understanding of the main forms of her nose. I use the same tools as before: the clay build-up brush, the stand-up brush, the move brush, the damp stand-up brush, all of them always in combination with the smooth brush, of course. And my main objective right now is not to create smooth surfaces or clean transitions between the component parts, but to block in all of the component parts in the first place. And for this reason, I have turned the base mesh into a dynamesh again. I'm using the default settings, so the resolution is around 128, and this results in a mesh that only consists of a few thousand polygons. Of course, the resolution settings in the dynamesh tab always depends a little bit on the scale of the model, so the smaller or the bigger the model in ZBrush is, the more or less polygons it will have with certain values. So you have to do some testing when you use your own meshes. But all in all, I try to start with a pretty low res model, so I do not have to deal with too many polygons at this stage. As you can see, I do not focus on one area all the time. I switch between different areas and try to pretty much do everything at the same time. And now I'm establishing the inner corners of the eyes. As you know, they are in line with the lateral edges of the nostrils, so you can basically draw a vertical line from the inner corners of the eyes down to the lateral edge of the nostril on both sides. And again, it is a little bit tricky to get the proportions right if you work only on a small part of the face, and this is mainly because a lot of the reference points that we usually have on the face and that are equally distributed on the head and the face are missing in this case. And for this reason, I sometimes have a hard time to get the proportions right. So sometimes the nose turns out to be a little bit too long or too short. Also, the distance between the eyes is not correct, and the width of the nose is not correct either. But this is not so important as long as you get the relationships and the proportions between the single component parts of the nose right, because this is where our main objective is when we do these quick studies. I have sped up the replay of this session quite a bit. It took me around 50 minutes to an hour to complete this piece from start to finish. So you see me working on the model approximately 5 times faster. But I'm sure that you have a very good understanding of how I approach these studies by now, also because of the previous chapter. Now, again, I'm focusing on different areas. I probably spend a little bit too much time on the eyes. This is always something that happens by accident, so to speak, because the eyes, or eyes in general, usually attract a lot of attention. So I have to force myself to switch back to the component parts of the nose. And again, the eyes, or at least the third of the eyes that we can see here, they really help to get the nose right. So it's not so useless to spend some time working out the eyes. And I'm switching back into profile view from time to time, because when you work from different angles, you tend to mess up the profile view. And for this reason, it is necessary to correct it again from time to time to get the main dimensions of the nose right. Then I'm trying to get a feeling for the entire face, even we can only see a portion of it. So I work out the Malo fat pad and try to picture how it flows down the cheeks. I do the same for the brow ridges and the arcus superciliaris, and try to embed everything as realistic as possible. Now, when you are in this initial stage, the entire process is quite fast, straightforward. You get a lot of things done in the first 15 to 20 minutes. And this is mainly because you are not so much concerned about creating nice volumes and forms or how the component parts interact with each other. It's much more about placing them approximately correct in the first place. But when the first 20 minutes are over, the entire sculpting process begins to slow down. And this is simply caused by the fact that you are now starting to focus on smaller areas. You try to create nice and solid forms, smooth surfaces, clean transitions between the component parts. And this simply takes some time. So you should try to establish the primary forms fast in the first stage of the sculpting process, and then you have to force yourself to slow down and to carefully focus on smaller areas next. And when you are ready to do this, it usually also makes sense to slightly increase the dynamesh resolution. You can, for instance, double the amount of polygons so that you have a little bit more mesh information or geometry available to work with and to focus on secondary details and transitions between the component parts. And that's exactly what I have done now. And at this stage, I am not going to change or to do large adjustments on the primary forms anymore, because I am usually already happy with how it looks at this stage. And now I'm focusing only on smaller details and smaller forms, and at the same time I try to clean up the volumes that I have already established so far. The process is the same as before. I am slowly browsing through my reference images and try to extract the characteristics and the essence of each image and try to transfer this into the sculpture. Sometimes I have already decided for a few pictures at this stage and ignore the rest, because not all of the reference images give me the same descriptive information that I need to finalize the sculpture. Now, you could really spend a lot of time finalizing and working out all of the small details, and you could try to get it as close to the reference images as possible. But in this case, my main objective was to get the main structure of the nose right. And of course, you could also spend a lot of time cleaning up the surface, making everything nice and smooth. But I usually have a little trick here, and I simply duplicate the model, and then I deactivate dynamesh, go down to the C remeasure feature in the geometry subpalette, set the polygon count quite high, and then run C remeasure to turn the high-res model into a low-res version. So that's exactly what I'm doing right now. And then you could simply project the details from the dynamesh back onto the new base mesh, but this is sometimes not even necessary. It depends a little bit on how high the polygon count is that you have set before you run the C remesher, but sometimes most of the fine details are still there after remeshing the model, and all you have to do is to apply a few subdivision levels and then use the tools that you were using before. Probably set the C intensity to an even lower value and then finalize the sculpture. And this of course has the advantage that I do not have to deal with all of the small surface irregularities that I had on the dynamesh before. I finalized the sculpture always with the underlying structure in mind, so I do not simply smooth out any of the secondary details or anatomical landmarks that I have established in the previous stages. So I try to deliver a polished sculpture, but I would like to give the viewer still the feeling of the underlying structure. And last but not least, I break up symmetry, so I simply deactivate symmetry and move parts around to create a slightly more interesting outline, slightly more interesting forms, and of course I do this always in consideration of the reference images. And then I take a few screenshots so that I have something to compare with in case I do a lot of these studies, and this usually helps me to make my progress obvious from the first to the last study. Now let's move on to the next one, and again it's the same OBJ file that I was using before, same procedure. Again, reference images are placed next to the ZBrush window, and I'm starting with establishing the width of the nose before I switch into profile view to get the main forms right. And again, this is important because we are not able to see what's going on and how far the nose comes out of the front plane of the face by just looking at the front view of a face.